October 23, 1942. Eastern Front. Somewhere along the frozen hell between Stalingrad and oblivion. The tin can looked pathetic in his hands, rusted edges, dented sides, filled with whatever he could scrape together from the wreckage of supply trucks and abandoned equipment. Sergeant Dmitry Volkov turned it over slowly, inspecting the crude fuse he'd wired together using parts from a broken radio and some blasting caps he'd salvaged 3 days earlier. The other soldiers watched him from across the makeshift camp, their faces showing everything from amusement to outright contempt. One of them, a young corporal named Alexei, actually laughed out loud. "What are you going to do with that, Volkov? Frighten them to death with your cooking?" The others joined in, their laughter cutting through the morning cold like shrapnel. Dmitri didn't respond. He just kept working, his fingers black with gunpowder and grease, his mind calculating weight ratios and blast radiuses, using nothing but instinct and half-remembered physics from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. This wasn't how Dmitry Volkov had imagined his contribution to the war. Before the conflict consumed his world, he'd been a school teacher in a small village outside Kiev, spending his days explaining mathematics to children who would rather be anywhere else. He'd never fired a weapon in anger, never seen a man die, never imagined he'd be crouching in frozen mud trying to weaponize household materials against the most advanced military machine ever assembled. But the Eastern Front had a way of transforming men, of burning away everything they thought they were and leaving only what they needed to become. When the invasion came in June of 1941, Dmitri had watched his village burn from 3 kilometers away, the smoke rising like a funeral pyre for everything he'd known. He'd joined the Red Army not out of ideology or patriotism, but out of the simple, burning need to make the people responsible pay for what they'd taken from him. Now, 16 months later, he was no longer a teacher. He was a survivor. And survivors learned to improvise. The German advance had been relentless. Since the initial invasion, their armored divisions had torn through Soviet defensive lines like paper, their Panzer tanks operating with a coordination and technological superiority that seemed almost supernatural to the poorly equipped Soviet forces trying desperately to slow them down. The German armor wasn't just superior in quality, it was overwhelming in quantity. Panzer IIIs and IVs rolled across the steppes in formations that stretched to the horizon, their crews confident in their vehicles' thick armor, plating, and powerful 75mm cannons. Soviet anti-tank weapons were in desperately short supply. The standard PTRD anti-tank rifle could penetrate armor at close range, but they were rare, heavy, and required 2 men to operate effectively. Most infantry units had nothing but small arms, grenades designed for personnel rather than vehicles, and the fading hope that someone, somewhere, would send them the weapons they needed to survive. Dmitri's unit had been promised anti-tank guns 3 weeks earlier. They were still waiting, and the German armor was getting closer every single day. The shed where Dmitri worked stood behind the ruins of what had once been a collective farm. Its walls were pockmarked with bullet holes, its roof partially collapsed from artillery fire. Inside, he'd assembled what amounted to a primitive laboratory, gathering every scrap of potentially useful material he could find across the scorched landscape. Broken munitions, unexploded ordnance too damaged for normal use, metal fragments from destroyed vehicles, powder from damaged ammunition that the quartermasters had written off as too unstable for standard issue. He'd started experimenting 2 weeks earlier, after watching 3 of his friends die trying to disable a single tank with nothing but standard grenades that bounced harmlessly off the armored hull. There had to be a better way. There had to be something that could give infantry soldiers a fighting chance against vehicles that seemed invincible. His first attempts had been failures. One device had failed to detonate at all. Another had exploded prematurely during testing, nearly taking his hand off in the process. But slowly, through trial and error that would have horrified any trained explosives expert, he'd begun to understand the principles involved: shaped charges, directed explosions, the concentration of blast force into a penetrating jet rather than dispersing it uselessly in all directions. His commanding officer, Captain Sokolov, had told him to stop wasting time on foolishness. The captain was old-school military, a man who believed weapons came from factories and armies, not from schoolteachers playing chemist in abandoned sheds. "You're going to blow yourself up, Volkov," Sokolov had warned him 3 days earlier. "And when you do, I'm not explaining to headquarters why we lost a perfectly good soldier to his own stupidity." But Sokolov hadn't ordered him to stop, not directly. Because deep down, the captain knew what everyone knew. They were outgunned, undersupplied, and running out of time. If a schoolteacher thought he could build something useful from garbage and desperation, who was Sokolov to tell him no? Even false hope was better than no hope at all. Dmitri understood the skepticism. He felt it himself every time he looked at his creation. The device looked like exactly what it was, an improvised contraption assembled by someone with more determination than training. But the physics were sound, the powder mixture was properly balanced, the fuse mechanism would work. It had to work, because if it didn't, if this was just another waste of time and materials, then what exactly were they supposed to do when the next wave of German armor came rolling over the ridge? The morning of October 23rd started with the sound of distant engines, the low rumble that every soldier on the Eastern Front had learned to recognize immediately, the mechanical growl that meant tanks were moving, and they were moving in your direction. Dmitri was still in the shed, putting the finishing touches on his 6th device, when Alexei burst through the door, his face pale with fear. "They're coming. Armor column, at least 20 vehicles, maybe more. They broke through the line at Sector 7. Dmitri's hands froze. Sector 7 was 6 kilometers away. At standard advance speed, that gave them maybe 30 minutes before the tanks reached their position. He looked down at the 6 crude devices lined up on the workbench. 6 improvised anti-tank weapons against 20 German panzers. The mathematics weren't encouraging. "Where's Sokolov?" he asked, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his stomach. "Dead. Artillery strike took out the command post 15 minutes ago. We're scattered, maybe 30 men still combat effective, and we've got nothing that can stop armor. We're supposed to fall back to the secondary line, but half the unit doesn't even know which direction that is anymore." Dmitri carefully gathered his devices, placing them in a canvas bag he'd prepared for exactly this purpose. His hands were shaking now, but not from fear, from something else, from the realization that his improvised weapons were about to face their first real test, and if they failed, a lot of good soldiers were going to die. As he emerged from the shed, he could see the rest of his unit scrambling to establish defensive positions that everyone knew were meaningless against armored assault. Men clutched rifles that would do nothing against steel plating. They set up machine gun positions that might slow infantry, but would be crushed the moment a tank rolled forward. The sky to the east was beginning to darken with smoke from the German advance, the artillery barrage that always preceded their armored thrusts, now rolling across the frozen earth like distant thunder. Alexei grabbed his arm as he passed. "What are you doing, Volkov? We need to move now." Dmitri shook his head slowly. "Someone needs to slow them down, give everyone else time to reach the secondary line." The young corporal stared at him in disbelief. "Slow them down? With what? With your homemade toys? You'll get yourself killed for nothing." Perhaps Alexei was right. Perhaps this was suicide dressed up as heroism, the desperate act of a man who'd already lost everything that mattered and was simply looking for a meaningful way to end it. But Dmitri didn't think so. He thought about the physics, about the shaped charges and directed explosions, about the careful calculations he'd made in that rusted shed. He thought about his students back in Kiev, children who would never solve another equation, who would never grow up to use the mathematics he'd tried to teach them. And he thought about the German tankers who would roll through this position unopened if someone didn't at least try to make them pay a price for their advance. "Maybe I will," he said quietly, pulling his arm free from Alexei's grip. "But I'm going to take some of them with me when I go." He moved forward toward the eastern ridge, toward the growing rumble of approaching armor, toward what everyone assumed would be his death. Behind him, he could hear orders being shouted, men preparing to fall back, the chaos of a defensive line that was already beginning to collapse. But Dmitri kept walking, his bag of improvised weapons slung over his shoulder, his mind already working through the tactics he'd need to employ. Get close. Target the engine compartment or tracks. Throw and move. Don't stay in one position long enough for them to coordinate fire. Simple principles, almost impossible to execute. But what choice did he have? The ridge overlooked a shallow valley that the German armor would have to cross to reach the Soviet positions. Dmitri positioned himself behind the burning wreckage of a supply truck, its blackened frame providing minimal cover but excellent concealment in the smoke that now filled the air. From here, he had a clear view of the approach route, and from here, he would make his stand. The 1st Panzer crested the ridge exactly 17 minutes later. It was a Panzer IV, the workhorse of the German armored divisions, its long 75mm gun scanning methodically for targets. Behind it, more tanks began to appear, a coordinated formation moving with the practiced efficiency that had made German armor tactics legendary across every theater of the war. Dmitri's mouth went dry. In all his planning, all his calculations, he'd never truly confronted the reality of facing these machines up close. The Panzer IV weighed over 20 tons of steel, powered by a 300-horsepower engine that could propel it at speeds of up to 40 kilometers per hour. Its frontal armor was 50 millimeters thick, angled to deflect incoming rounds. Its crew consisted of 5 highly trained men who'd spent months learning to operate as a single deadly organism, and he was going to attack it with a tin can filled with homemade explosives. The lead tank rolled forward, its tracks churning the frozen earth into mud. Dmitri waited, his breathing controlled, his hands steady despite the absolute terror that threatened to overwhelm him. Closer. Closer. He needed to be within throwing range, needed the angle to be right for the charge to penetrate effectively. When the tank was 15 meters away, he pulled the fuse on his first device. The mechanism ignited with a soft hiss, giving him exactly 3 seconds before detonation. Time seemed to slow as he rose from cover, his arm drawing back, his entire body committing to the throw. The device tumbled through the air in a perfect arc, landing directly beneath the tank's exposed undercarriage, right between the front and middle road wheels. The explosion wasn't loud, not like artillery or aerial bombs. It was a sharp, focused crack that seemed almost anticlimactic in its brevity. But the effect was devastating. The shaped charge punched through the bottom armor plating with focused fury, the explosion channeling upward into the engine compartment. Flames erupted from the tank's grills within seconds. The vehicle lurched to a stop, black smoke pouring from every seam and opening. The hatch flew open, and crew members began scrambling out, their uniforms smoking, their faces blackened with soot and blood. For a moment, Dmitri simply stared, unable to believe what he'd just witnessed. It had worked. The physics, the calculations, the desperate improvisation, all of it had actually worked. But there was no time to celebrate. The 2nd Panzer was already swinging its turret in his direction, the commander having spotted his position through the smoke. He ran. The ground behind him exploded as the 75mm cannon fired, the high explosive round turning his former position into a crater of torn earth and shattered metal. He dove behind a destroyed Soviet artillery piece, scrambling through the debris, his mind racing through tactical calculations. The German crews knew they were under attack now. They'd be more cautious, more alert. He needed to move unpredictably, strike from unexpected angles, create chaos faster than they could respond to it. The 2nd tank was rolling forward, trying to flank his position. Dmitri circled left, using the smoke from the first burning Panzer as concealment. He pulled out his 2nd device, primed the fuse, and waited until the tank passed within 10 meters of his hiding spot. This time, he aimed for the tracks themselves. The explosion sheared through the metal links, sending broken track sections flying in multiple directions. The tank lurched sideways, its right track completely disabled, its mobility reduced to useless pivoting on a single functioning side. The crew never saw him. He was already moving to his next position before they even understood what had happened. 3 minutes had passed since his first attack. 2 tanks disabled. But the others were adjusting now, their formations tightening, their commanders communicating through radio to coordinate their response. This was the critical moment. If they organized effectively, if they brought their full firepower to bear on his position, he'd be dead within seconds. But Dmitri had one advantage that the German tankers lacked. He knew this ground, every crater, every piece of wreckage, every slight depression in the terrain that could provide cover. He'd spent 2 weeks mapping this exact battlefield, preparing for defensive operations that command had never believed would be necessary. now that local knowledge was the only thing keeping him alive. He moved like a ghost through the smoke and chaos, appearing long enough to strike before vanishing again into the burning landscape. The third tank died when he managed to climb onto its rear deck while it was focused on other threats, placing his device directly against the engine louvers. The fourth lost its tracks to a throw that landed with surgical precision under its exposed running gear. 5 tanks, 6, 7. Each attack refined his technique, taught him something new about timing, angle, and placement. The German formations were fragmenting now, commanders uncertain whether they were facing a single attacker or an entire anti-tank unit. Some tanks pushed forward aggressively, trying to break through what they assumed was an organized defensive line. Others pulled back, unwilling to advance until the threat could be properly identified and neutralized. Dmitri was operating on pure adrenaline now, his mind sharper than it had ever been, his body moving with an efficiency born from absolute necessity. He wasn't thinking about survival anymore, wasn't contemplating the odds or calculating his chances. There was only the next throw, the next explosion, the next tank that needed to burn. He'd become something he'd never imagined he could be. Not a soldier, not a hero, just a weapon himself, as crude and improvised and desperately effective as the devices he carried. By the time he primed his last device, 43 minutes had passed since his first attack. 43 minutes that felt like 43 hours, every second stretched into eternity by the intensity of focused combat. His uniform was torn and blackened. His hands were bleeding from crawling across shattered metal and broken glass. His ears rang from repeated explosions at close range, but he was still alive, still fighting, still moving toward the next target with mechanical determination. The 14th tank was a command variant, its antenna arrays marking it as a communication hub for the entire formation. If he could disable it, he could create organizational chaos beyond just the physical damage to the vehicle itself. He approached from downwind, using the smoke from burning wrecks to mask his movement. The commander was standing in the turret hatch, binoculars pressed to his eyes, trying to coordinate his remaining vehicles. He never saw the small figure that emerged from the smoke behind his position. Dmitri's final device landed perfectly against the tank's rear armor, right where the engine compartment was most vulnerable. The explosion was the loudest yet, the shaped charge penetrating through the thinner rear plating and detonating something inside, probably fuel or ammunition. The entire vehicle seemed to lift slightly, flames erupting from every opening. The commander toppled backward from the turret, his binoculars flying from his hands, and then, suddenly, impossibly, it was over. Dmitri crouched behind wreckage, his canvas bag empty, his body shaking from exhaustion and shock. Around him, 14 German tanks stood silent. Some burned with black oily smoke. Some sat crippled with damaged tracks or disabled engines. Some had been abandoned by crews who'd fled rather than wait to see what would kill them next. The remaining tanks, the ones he'd never reached, had pulled back beyond the ridge, their commanders unwilling to advance further into what had proven to be an effective killing zone. The silence was deafening. For the first time in nearly an hour, Dmitri could hear something other than explosions and engine noise. Birds were calling in the distance, apparently unconcerned with the human drama unfolding beneath them. The wind moved through the tall grass that still grew in patches untouched by warfare. And in that silence, Dmitri realized something profound. He'd succeeded, not just in disabling enemy vehicles, but in buying time. Time for his unit to retreat, time for new defensive lines to be established. Time measured in minutes that might ultimately be measured in lives saved. He stood slowly, his legs barely able to support his weight. The ridge where the German tanks had retreated was quiet now, the enemy apparently reassessing their entire approach to this sector. How long would that last? An hour? A day? It didn't matter. He'd done what he set out to do, achieved something that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. As he began walking back toward friendly lines, movement caught his eye. Figures were emerging from concealment, Soviet soldiers who'd stayed behind rather than retreat, who'd watched his entire engagement from whatever cover they could find. Alexei was among them, his face showing an expression Dmitri had never seen before. Not respect, exactly, something closer to awe. "Volkov," the young corporal said quietly, his voice barely audible, "what you just did, I've never seen anything like it. Dmitri looked down at his empty hands, at the burns and cuts that covered them. I just used what I had, he said simply, same as anyone would. But they both knew that wasn't true. What Dmitri had done wasn't normal, wasn't standard, wasn't anything that military doctrine or training manuals would have prepared anyone for. He'd taken the principles of shaped charge warfare, combined them with desperate improvisation and suicidal courage, and created a completely new tactical approach to anti-armor combat. Behind them, reinforcements were finally arriving, fresh troops and actual anti-tank guns that should have been there hours earlier. Officers were already moving forward to assess the damage, to count the disabled vehicles, to try to understand what exactly had happened in this valley. A major approached Dmitri, his uniform clean and pressed, marking him as someone who'd been well behind the lines until very recently. "Soldier," the major said, his tone uncertain, "did you do this? All of this?" Dmitri nodded slowly, too exhausted for proper military courtesy. The major looked past him at the field of burning tanks, at the devastation that shouldn't have been possible. "With what? What weapons did you use?" "Improvised devices, sir, shaped charges constructed from salvaged materials." The major's expression shifted from confusion to something harder to read. "You're telling me that you disabled 14 German tanks using homemade weapons?" "Yes, sir." "That's impossible. Anti-tank warfare requires specialized equipment, trained personnel, coordinated fire. One man can't." He stopped speaking as another officer approached, this one carrying what appeared to be the remains of one of Dmitri's devices, recovered from near a disabled tank. The major examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands with the kind of fascination usually reserved for alien artifacts. "This is crude," he said slowly. "The construction is amateurish. The materials are improvised. The fusing mechanism is dangerous to the user. This shouldn't work at all." He paused, looking at the field of destroyed armor again. "But obviously it does." News of Dmitri's actions spread through the Soviet forces faster than any official report could have traveled. By evening, soldiers 50 kilometers away were already hearing exaggerated versions of the story. The schoolteacher who destroyed 20 tanks, the lone soldier who stopped an entire armored division, the man who built weapons from garbage and changed the course of a battle. Most of the stories were wrong in their details, but they got the essential truth right. One man, with nothing but improvised weapons and desperate courage, had proven that German armor wasn't invincible, that infantry soldiers didn't have to simply die when tanks appeared, that innovation and determination could overcome technological superiority. The Soviet High Command took immediate interest. Within 3 days, Dmitri found himself pulled from the front lines and transported to a military research facility near Moscow. Engineers and weapons designers wanted to examine his devices, understand the principles behind them, determine whether his approach could be standardized and mass-produced. Dmitri showed them everything: the powder mixtures he'd developed through trial and error, the shaped charge designs that focused explosive force into penetrating jets, the fusing mechanisms that could be constructed from readily available materials. Most importantly, he taught them the mindset behind improvised warfare, the willingness to experiment, to fail, to try again with different approaches. To look at salvaged materials not as garbage, but as potential components, to understand that sophisticated weapons were simply principles applied through manufacturing, and those same principles could be applied through improvisation when manufacturing wasn't available. The result of this knowledge transfer would eventually become apparent across the Eastern Front. Soviet forces began developing and deploying increasingly sophisticated anti-tank grenades based on shaped charge principles. The RPG-43, introduced in 1943, used a cone-shaped liner to focus explosive force into a penetrating jet capable of destroying any German tank then in service. Millions of these grenades would be produced before the war's end, giving Soviet infantry the weapon they desperately needed against enemy armor. But the impact of Dmitri's actions extended far beyond simple weapon design. His story became part of Soviet military culture, a legend that demonstrated the power of individual initiative in the face of overwhelming odds. When soldiers felt outmatched by superior German technology, they remembered the schoolteacher who built weapons from scrap metal. When officers doubted the combat effectiveness of improvised equipment, they were reminded of 14 disabled tanks and one man with a canvas bag full of crude devices. The German forces, for their part, learned their own lessons from the engagement. After-action reports documented the attack in clinical detail, analyzing how a single infantry soldier had caused disproportionate damage to an armored formation. Tank tactics were modified to reduce vulnerability to close-range infantry assault. Formations adjusted to provide better mutual support. Infantry screening of armored advances was increased. All of this because a schoolteacher with no formal military training had proven that German tactical doctrine had a weakness that could be exploited by sufficiently determined opponents. The psychological impact was perhaps even more significant than the tactical changes. German tankers who'd operated with supreme confidence now understood that every pile of rubble, every crater, every bit of smoke could conceal an enemy willing to crawl within throwing range and destroy their vehicle. The invincibility that had characterized early German armored operations evaporated, replaced by caution and uncertainty that slowed advances and reduced operational effectiveness. Dmitry Volkov never returned to the front lines. The Soviet military decided his knowledge was too valuable to risk in combat, and he spent the remainder of the war training other soldiers in improvised warfare techniques. After the war, he returned to teaching, though not to the same village. That village no longer existed, had been erased from the map during the initial invasion. Instead, he taught in Moscow, educating a new generation of students in the mathematics and physics he'd used to save his own life and the lives of countless others. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. When students asked about the medals that occasionally appeared on his civilian jacket during commemorative events, he would deflect the questions with vague references to doing what needed to be done. But those who knew him, who understood what he'd accomplished on that October morning in 1942, recognized something important. Dmitry Volkov had proven that warfare wasn't just about superior technology or overwhelming force. It was about human ingenuity, about the ability to adapt and improvise and refuse to accept defeat even when every rational calculation suggested surrender was the only logical option. He'd taken the principles of physics taught in peaceful classrooms and transformed them into weapons of war. More importantly, he demonstrated that individual courage and creativity could change outcomes that seemed predetermined by industrial and technological superiority. The soldiers who'd mocked his crude devices never spoke about their early skepticism. Some of them didn't survive the war to feel embarrassed about their initial reactions, but those who did survive carried the memory of that morning with them for the rest of their lives. The image of Dmitry Volkov walking calmly toward certain death, carrying a bag full of improvised weapons that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The sound of shaped charges punching through German armor, the sight of 14 disabled tanks scattered across a valley that should have been an easy advance for enemy forces. Most of all, they remembered the lesson inherent in Dmitry's actions. That warfare creates impossible situations, and the soldiers who survive are the ones who refuse to accept impossibility as an answer. That innovation doesn't require laboratories and formal training, just desperate need and willingness to experiment. That one man with determination and creativity can sometimes accomplish what entire units with proper equipment cannot. These weren't the lessons taught in military academies or found in tactical manuals, but they were the lessons that won the Eastern Front, one improvised solution at a time, one impossible victory built from refuse and desperation. In the decades after the war, military historians would analyze the engagement in technical terms, discussing shape charge penetration values and armor vulnerability angles. But the soldiers who'd been there understood something the historians could never fully capture. They'd witnessed the moment when everything everyone thought they knew about warfare proved insufficient. When the official doctrine, the established tactics, the manufactured weapons all failed to provide what was needed. And they'd seen one man step forward with nothing but improvised equipment and unreasonable courage to fill that gap. Dmitry Volkov died in 1987 at the age of 73, surrounded by former students who'd gone on to become engineers and scientists and teachers themselves. His obituary in Pravda mentioned his wartime service briefly, focusing instead on his contributions to Soviet education. But veterans who read the notice knew better. They understood that the careful, methodical teacher who'd spent decades explaining mathematics to bored students was the same man who'd once crawled through smoke and fire to destroy 14 German tanks in 48 minutes. The same man who'd proven that education and warfare weren't separate worlds, but different applications of the same fundamental principles. Problem identification, creative thinking, practical application, iterative refinement. These principles worked equally well for teaching quadratic equations and building improvised weapons, for helping students understand physics and using those same physics principles to disable armored vehicles. Perhaps that's the most remarkable aspect of Dmitry Volkov's story. Not the battlefield heroics, though those were certainly extraordinary. Not the technological innovation, though that changed the course of anti-armor warfare on the Eastern Front, but rather the demonstration that the human mind, properly applied, can transform any situation. That the same intellectual tools used for peaceful purposes can be redirected toward survival when circumstances demand it. That civilization and warfare aren't opposites, but different contexts for the same fundamental human capabilities. Today, the valley where Dmitry made his stand has been reclaimed by agriculture. The tanks were salvaged long ago for scrap metal. The craters have been filled and planted over. Nothing remains to mark the location where one man changed the tactical calculus of armored warfare through sheer determination and improvised weapons. But the story endures, passed down through military culture, analyzed in tactical training, referenced whenever someone suggests that proper equipment and technological superiority will always overcome individual initiative. Because Dmitry Volkov proved something that every generation of soldiers needs to learn for themselves, that the weapon matters less than the person wielding it, that creativity and courage can overcome technological disadvantage. That victory sometimes comes not from having better equipment than your enemy, but from using whatever equipment you have with greater determination and ingenuity than they expect anyone to possess. The soldiers who laughed at his homemade grenade learned this lesson in the most dramatic way possible. They watched in stunned silence as their crude mockery transformed into burning German tanks. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that expertise doesn't always come from formal training or official positions. Sometimes it emerges from necessity, from the desperate innovation of someone with more problems than solutions, and the refusal to accept that impossible odds mean inevitable defeat. And that realization, multiplied across millions of soldiers over years of brutal conflict, helped transform the Eastern Front from a rout into a grinding stalemate that eventually reversed into Soviet advance. Not because of superior Soviet technology, which remained inferior to German equipment for most of the war. Not because of better tactical doctrine, which the Germans pioneered and perfected, but because of individual Soviet soldiers who learned from Dmitry's example that they didn't have to accept the limitations of their equipment or the superiority of their enemy's technology. They could improvise, they could innovate, they could take whatever materials they found and transform them into weapons. Most importantly, they could fight back against overwhelming odds, and sometimes, impossibly, they could win.